MMA is a sport full of different types of fighters, of different shapes, sizes and styles. This has seen towering MMA fighters the size of NBA players to 5'3" Olympic gold medalists. Today we are looking at those genetic freaks, those fighters who just seem to defy the laws of human nature. Whether possessing absolute monstrous power or a crazy physique akin to a bodybuilder or physical genetics that just don't make sense, with a crazy weird frame and body. This is the Fight franchise and the top 10 genetic freaks in MMA history. Before we get started, some of these guys may have been on the secret sauce and tested positive for certain supplements. That being said, I still consider them genetic freaks due to their body and physical attributes they possess, even though they may have been enhanced. Number 10. Herschel Walker. MMA is a young man's sport for the most part. It is quite rare for fighters in their late 30s and early 40s to see success. But what about making your MMA debut at 47? That is what NFL running back Herschel Walker did, deciding to compete in MMA at 47 years old, where he was in better shape than guys 20 years younger than him. Herschel Walker, having a great American football career, was a brilliant athlete, remaining in amazing shape throughout his career. He would go to AKA, the gym which has now been home to Cain Velasquez, DC, Luke Rockhold and Khabib, and would train with Crazy Bob Cook. He competed and had 2 fights in Strikeforce, winning both fights via stoppage, just to show how proficient he was in the cage. Just imagine, he was doing this at 47. Can you believe what he could have done if he started in MMA instead of going into football? He could have become one of the best ever. Chiseled out of granite at 47 and being successful in MMA, Herschel Walker is one freak athlete. Number 9. Bob Sapp. During the early MMA, it was a freak show with all kind of fighters, and arguably the biggest freak was Bob Sapp. Sapp would compete in college football and would be the 69th pick in the NFL draft and be signed for the Minnesota Vikings. He would play only 1 game for the Vikings but would be popped for steroids and dropped by the Vikings and would go on to work in a funeral home. Sapp's friend told him to try pro wrestling, where he competed in NWA and then went over to New Japan Pro Wrestling. During his time in Japan, Bob Sapp competed in K1 and also Pride, where in Pride he was the biggest freak there. He was the biggest heavyweight there, where he used his physicality to score some good wins and have some fun fights where he just picked up and slammed his opponents. In his second fight, he took on Big Nog in one of the most legendary fights in Pride history. Unfortunately, Sapp didn't like taking damage, which meant he would just take a loss without really fighting back, giving him a terrible record and losing streak. But that time in Japan, seeing this huge 300+ pound guy with abs and muscles compete was a sight to behold. Number 8. Alex Volkanovski. A lot of people, when you think of genetic freaks in MMA, Volkanovski probably wouldn't come to your mind, but he most certainly is. Growing up playing rugby in Australia before MMA, Volkanovski at 5'6" and his short stocky frame was walking around at 214 pounds to compete in rugby. For context, that's what Khamzat Chimaev probably walked around at welterweight, and he's around 6'2". Losing the weight, he competed at welterweight at just 5'6" back in Australia and slowly trimmed down to featherweight. But what makes Volk such a genetic freak, at 5'6", he has a 71-inch reach, which was 2 inches longer than his rival Max Holloway, who is 5'11". Volk, with his stocky frame and old rugby days, has unreal strength and power and possesses some insane cardio. To go up in weight to fight the bigger Islam Makhachev and to be able to have success in the grappling exchanges just shows how strong he is. Plus, he even had the reach advantage over Makhachev to show how freaky his genetics are. Number 7. Kamaru Usman. Many, probably a lot like Volkanovski, may not consider Usman a genetic freak, but he most certainly deserves a spot on this list. During Tyron Woodley's title reign, he looked invincible and was being compared to GSP. Woodley was jacked and quite the genetic freak in his own right, but when he did the face-off against Usman at the weigh-in, we saw the difference in size between both guys, where Usman was just bigger physically, and we saw how that translated in the octagon, where he dominated Woodley over 5 rounds with his wrestling and physicality. What gets Usman on the list and what makes him such a genetic freak is how well-rounded he is. Strength, power, physicality and cardio, he was good overall and had such a brilliant game. Colby Covington, who is just as well rounded, only lost because the power Usman had was just too much for Colby to handle. A 15-fight win streak in the UFC, dominating the competition with his wrestling strength with one of the best resumes ever, Usman is a true genetic freak, and if you look at what it took to stop his epic run, was one of the best KOs ever. It just shows how much of a genetic freak he is and how good he was. Number 6. Anthony Rumble Johnson. He fought across 4 weight divisions and possessed some of the craziest power in MMA history. Anthony Rumble Johnson got started in MMA and was competing at welterweight, where he was absolutely jacked and shredded, where he was scoring some brilliant wins and finishes. The weight cut, however, would be a burden, as he kept missing weight and decided to move up to middleweight but missed weight there as well and lost to Vitor Belfort. That's when Anthony Johnson decided to move up to light heavyweight, where he would become the most devastating knockout artist in light heavyweight history, where he was putting out people left, right right and centre. Rumble at welterweight was jacked and shredded and quite a big guy, but at light heavyweight he hulked up and was a massive beast who possessed devastating power. If somebody said to you when he was fighting at welterweight that this guy would be the most powerful KO artist in light heavyweight history, you would have called them insane, which shows how much of a freak Rumble truly was. Number 5. Kevin Randomman. The monster Kevin Randomman was a brilliant NCAA wrestler in college who would compete in MMA in the early days. Kevin at 5'10" was absolutely jacked and one of the most tenacious fighters ever, and even Dana White has said how much of a genetic freak Randomman was, which definitely helps his cause on this list. He would win the UFC heavyweight championship with his amazing skills and wrestling. Though he was jacked, he was short, which when he took on slightly bigger guys wasn't a problem, shown in his epic battle with Fedor Emelianenko, throwing Fedor on his neck like he was nothing. He possessed some amazing strength, ragdolling his opponents like crazy, and if he fought today, many fans would have loved his wrestling style. He also had crazy power, shown when he went to Pride and took on Mirko Cro Cop as an underdog and would KO Cro Cop, who was the brilliant kickboxing champion, where Randomman was just a wrestler with crazy power. Kevin was a true one-of-one athlete and a rare breed MMA saw in the early days, absolutely jacked from head to toe. Unfortunately, Randomman passed in 2016 with complications with pneumonia, but let's not forget how crazy the monster was in the early days of MMA. A true genetic freak and one of the craziest in MMA history. Number 4. Francis Ngannou. The most power any MMA fighter has ever possessed. Francis Ngannou is a physical specimen. Growing up in Cameroon, Francis would work in a sand quarry from a young age until he immigrated all the way from Africa to France and began competing in combat sports. Due to his sheer size and power, he took to combat sports with ease, KOing the competition and would be signed by the UFC. The heavyweight division in the UFC saw some freaks over the years, but Francis was just different. He was 265 pounds pure muscle with abs at heavyweight, and he was KOing all the competition. Even on his original streak when he joined the UFC, Dana had him test his power, where his punch was the most powerful in the world. Francis was an unreal freak, where we saw him KO the competition, but he got even crazier when we saw him wrestle and throw around 250 pound Cyril Gane like he was nothing, which just shows how strong he is. Genuinely, you can argue him and any of our next 3 as number 1, as Ngannou and our next 3 entries are the craziest genetic freaks in MMA history. Number 3. Brock Lesnar. Arguably one of the greatest athletes in the history of the world, Brock Lesnar would have a stellar amateur wrestling career, winning NCAA titles and was an absolute beast. He would go to WWE and was a freak there, F5ing 500 pound Big Show and doing a shooting star press at WrestleMania. After that, he attempted to compete in the NFL, despite not playing football since high school. Lesnar would sign with the Minnesota Vikings but would never compete and decided to move to MMA. He would join the UFC and was gigantic and was bigger than all the other heavyweights, where he dominated using his physical power and wrestling to dominate and win the UFC heavyweight title in less than 2 years of making his debut in MMA. Brock was a gigantic human and a freak and was one of the biggest and baddest in the heavyweight division, where he had some brilliant wins, and to try and compete in all these different sports is crazy, which just shows how crazy he is physically to be a wrestling champ, compete in WWE, to be a UFC champ and make an NFL team. He is a freak of nature and one of the biggest in MMA history. Number 2. Yoel Romero. With a nickname the Soldier of God, Yoel Romero looks like he's carved out of stone. Coming from Cuba, Yoel competed in the Cuban wrestling program and worked his way up and ended up competing in the Olympics in the 2000, where he managed to get a silver medal. He competed in the 2004 Olympics and got 4th place, just missing out on the podium spot. A few years after this, he would get started in MMA at the age of 32 and would go on a tear of the middleweight division, with his explosive power and unorthodox fighting style landing some powerful KOs, which included some amazing flying knees. In his mid-30s, he was an elite middleweight competing with the best fighters of the division, some of which were years younger than him. He has been in some incredible wars where he has showed off his iron chin, which can take a beating and still keep going. He is athletic in every way possible, but it may be the story to come from Joe Rogan, where the UFC doctor had said he is the freakiest athlete he has ever come across, possessing eye tendons 3 times larger than the average human, which meant he could heal faster. He has been fighting with a fused neck after breaking his neck, where he has little to no movement in his neck throughout his MMA career. A true genetic freak of nature who was an Olympic wrestler who was more feared for his crazy knockout power than his wrestling background, which got him a silver medal. Genuinely, you can argue Yoel as number 1, but it's just that number 1 is a genetic freak and probably the greatest MMA fighter ever. Number 1. Jon Jones. Everybody on this list is a genetic freak, but this man is a true genetic freak of MMA. But what makes him number one on the list is how successful it has made him. Jon Jones is an amazing fighter with a brilliant mind for fighting and IQ, but his physical frame and attributes he possesses makes him that much better. Fighting at light heavyweight, he was 6'5", where he was taller than everyone in the division until Gustafsson came along, but he was also taller than most heavyweights bar Stefan Struve of his era. He possesses an 85-inch reach, which is one of the longest in UFC history, alongside Struve, who is 7 foot. He has extremely long legs, which have helped him develop a brilliant kicking game. Though he lifts crazy amounts of weight, he is not that muscular developed on certain parts of his body, like his calves, which are tiny. It's like his body only builds muscle where it needs it. With brothers who compete in the NFL, he has some amazing athletic genetics, which have shown across his fight career, outstriking some of the best on the feet and out-wrestling Olympic level wrestlers. If you wanted to create the perfect frame and physique for a fighter, you probably couldn't do better than what life gave Jon Jones. And the fact it has worked, possessing the best record of any fighter, this is why it gets number one. This list is full of genetic freaks, but Jon Jones just ended up becoming the greatest MMA fighter ever, which is why he deserves number one as the biggest genetic freak in MMA history. Did you enjoy the video? Let us know down in the comments below. Who do you think is the top 10 genetic freaks in MMA history? Put your top 10 in the comments below. And who did I miss out on this list? Put that down in the comments below. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe for MMA and more fight content coming soon. We hope you enjoyed the video and we'll catch you in the next one.